And welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. And today I'm with John F. White, who has the show Krekkenford, independent researcher in all things ancient Indo-European mythology. Not even just that, just mythology in general. It's really one of my go-tos. I like this channel a lot. I highly recommend it. That's why he's on my channel right now, because his stuff is you're just knocking it out the park lately. And yeah, you really are. And we're gonna start off talking about the divine twins, but this is gonna be just a loose conversation. It's not gonna be like we're not gonna be like honed in too much on just the divine twin. We're just gonna start there, and then check out the chat. Everybody super chats are definitely highly appreciated, but also I'll look for comments as well. We're just gonna chat about this basically, and the question is. I'll start off with a question. Maybe you can take it. Maybe you could take it away with this. My question for you: the etymology of the Dioscuri, these divine twins, and when the more I get into these, like, for example, the Samothraces, who are supposedly they've been there on this island before the entire, I guess you would say, the way we look at the Hellenization movement, before Alexander the Great, before going back to maybe the Bronze Age, these people had this sort of theology of a sky father, an earth mother, and then these divine twins. And I'm wondering, how far back does this sort of mythology go? Does this go back to the ballpark that you're focused on with the Proto-Indo-European stuff? Because that word Dioscuri has that word Dios in it, and whenever you see that, you're like, oh, that's Dios, Sky Father.
Yes.
So, what do you think about that?
Well, that is one big question there, Neil. So absolutely. So this is connected with Dyaús, which basically means God's sons, or Zeus's sons when you talk about the Greek Dioscuri. So. And you can argue that Zeus was around before the Indo-Europeans turned up in Greece, and you can certainly argue for the fact that there was an Earth Mother from the Demeter and all that before then. And because there is such strong myth about the divine twins, and pretty consistent myth across from Europe into India and through Persia, it would be fair to say that the premise of having the divine twins within a pantheon it is probably very old indeed, and certainly stretches back at least 4,000 years, but I would expect it to be a lot older than that. And I'd expect it to be a lot older than that, purely because if you're in a society and someone gives birth to identical twins, that's pretty unusual, and it'll be very more unusual in those days due to the fact that having a twin birth would be exceptionally dangerous. So to have a twin birth and the twins grow up and survive, that would be seen as something, quite miraculous and quite astounding and something quite blessed. So, and I think there's over 600 myths about twins across the whole world.
Wow.
It was different types of motifs. So it is a very common motif. So yes, I absolutely think that the whole premise behind the divine twins is very much far older than the Indo-European piece, and it's be good to distinguish that, because in the Indo-European mythology we see that the divine twins are often associated with horses.
They're always on horses, always.
Pretty much. So, and that's because the term for horse in Indo-European is I think it's h₁éḳwos, and h₁éḳwos is aligned to what do they call them? The Dievas and the Aśvins and the like. That word is all cognate. So that word means of the horse. So we see that, but the horse is quite a late addition to the Indo-European culture, because initially it was the cow. And we see, and this is something we can wander off later and talk about, but initially we see the cow as being the animal of choice in Indo-European culture, because it was so useful, it had to come from God. So, but then what happens? We see that get translated into a horse, and that is because horses become really useful, doubly not only for meat and milk, but doubly so you want to go to war. You don't go into war riding a cow. You go into war riding a horse, and so I think that's where we really start seeing the myths we see today set up.
Wow.
Then what we also see, which I think you probably want to discuss later, is that we do see some contradiction in myth as well. So that there are some similarities, as I say, in these myths, and one of them is that the twins will often have different fathers. One will tend to have a father that's a god, and one will tend to have a father that's a powerful warrior. And what we see is that in certainly earlier Greek myths, so we have Homer. I think Homer says Castor was born from Zeus, but then Pindar, probably 150 years later, says it's Pollux who was born from Zeus. I think that's the right way around. So we actually, and we also see other poets say that they were both born of Zeus and things like that. So,
and one of them has eternal life, the other one is doomed to die.
Yes. Well, in fact, now this is sort of one of the other interesting aspects. So there's a chap called Wikander who's a very interesting chap, and he's written some brilliant papers on Ugaritic texts and the serpent in the Near East. And he did some investigation on this, and he actually came to a conclusion, which seems pretty good, that the divine twins weren't exactly the same, and partly because of this father figure. And he said that one would be associated with war and warriors and horses, is what you see, and the other tends to be associated with cattle or hounds and farming. And whilst, let's say, in the Rig Veda, the texts are in the Aśvins in the Rig Veda are said to be exactly the same. I think that's the one of the sort of motifs of the Rig Veda. And there you have Nakula and Sahadeva. That's within the Mahabharata. Wikander said there are subtle differences, and they actually cause distinctions. You can actually see the difference, that one is like handsome and broad-shouldered, and the other one looks after cattle and dogs. I mean, they're subtle there. And then what you find is that in some mythology, and certainly more European mythology, the one that is associated with sort of cattle and dogs tends to disappear. So you'll find in the very earliest myths of Pollux and Castor that Pollux ends up being, I think it is the patron of the Roman legion or Roman garrisons, and Castor disappears. In Hengist and Horsa, who's a Germanic version of that, although it's more legendary rather than a myth, you see that Horsa disappears. Hengist means stallion, Horsa means horse, and you get this in the myth, and we see. It's quite interesting in the Indian mythology that Nakula and Sahadeva, as I say in the Mahabharata, then change to be individuals when you look at later texts. So, and I think their names. Let me quick. I've got a note somewhere. Nakula. Nakula comes Nápātā, and Sahadeva comes Dasra in later texts in the Indian. In the sort of post-Vedic texts. And that's quite interesting because you then see that flow into Persia. And in Persia, in the Vestas, you'll get, the names change, but everybody believes that Nápātā, who's come from Nakula, turns into nápātā as an individual, and he's a demon. And so that makes us think that Nakula was the warrior, because Persians were pretty much anti-war. So that gives us a feeling. And yet Sahadeva gets, well, we're not entirely sure. We think it gets translated into Attar, who is the son of Ahura Mazda, the creator in Zoroastrianism. So, but we actually start seeing, as I say, these twins aren't exactly the same. They do have different fathers. Therefore, they do have different properties. And then when push comes to shove over time, the lesser does fade away. They become individuals and fades away. And that's basically the general concept of the divine twins.
Wow, that's interesting.
Now, I can go a little bit further if you want to talk more about their sister, because that's very interesting as well.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, so they've got a sister, and their sister is meant to represent the dawn.
The dawn goddess. Yeah,
the
that's
dawn goddess, and that's meant to be a sister.
Denominator throughout myths that you see kind of
exactly. So she is the daughter of Dyaús. There's his daughter, and what we find then is because the father of either Castor or Pollux, or it depends on what version of the myth you read, is also the father. The general is the father of Helena Troy. We actually find Helena is associated with I think it's Felina, which is cognate with the dawn goddess. So it actually looks like Helena Troy, the most beautiful woman in all of, I guess, Eurasia, according to the myth. It was actually a flavour of the dawn goddess that has been translated in myth as time's gone on.
Wow. And another fascinating thing about Helen of Troy people will love to hear is that W.B. Yeats, who is author of he's very important because not only was he a great poet and folklorist, but he sort of passed down some of the ancient Celtic mythology that would have been lost, that he kind of scrounged up together and put together in, I think, what is he, like the 1900s, something like that?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. That's not my field of expertise.
Yeah, I could be off. It could be the early 20s. Yeah. It could, whatever. Anyways, that was a while ago. But he had this weird, because he was not an atheist. He was completely, but he wasn't like a fundamentalist, any type of religion. He was like in his own category. By the way, he was a Rosicrucian too. And he had this belief that there was 3 messiahs. Well, the first messiah was Helen of Troy. The second messiah was Jesus of Nazareth. And the third messiah was going to come around the year 2000. And didn't say who.
Okay.
Who that is, nobody knows now because he's not here to say, but that was his belief. And that's, I remember learning that from my English teacher when I was in college, because he was a huge he would always bring out W.B. Yeats, and we'd we'd read about it and write about it because he was just such a good study for English. But I'll never forget that. Helen of Troy and Jesus of Nazareth on par together, like on the same level.
I think that works. I mean, I say this is the daughter of the main god. So that works. And that position sort of remains. I mean, we see it in European mythology that I think the story there with their twins is that the twins ride a chariot that pulls the sun or something. And I think one of the myths is that they had to save the sun from going in the sea. And that relates to the sun being the daughter. Right. So that's quite fascinating. That is, but as I say, we do see this. So the h₁éḳwos and Horsa is part of the myth's quite interesting as well. So that we see some very old German sort of folklore about h₁éḳwos and Horsa. One's a warrior and one's a farmer, and that's pre-text before we see it enter the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, where so if people don't know, h₁éḳwos and Horsa were the Anglo-Saxons, or probably Jutes actually, who came to England and in effect became the Anglo-Saxons of England. And they started that, and we see, and actually they had their battle in Cricklefold, which is why Cricklefold's named Cricklefold, because that's where I was born.
Wow, that's interesting.
So there you got the little side thing, but yeah, you see Horsa disappear, but yeah, but because that is legend rather than myth, because it's far more factual and happening in nearer our day rather than in mythic prehistoric times. We actually see some connection with real people. So h₁éḳwos is said to be 9 generations down from the son of Woden. I think it says in literature, and that was a common thing. So every king was 9 generations away from Odin or Woden, depending where they were in terms of sort of Germanic based or Germanic derived tribes. So yeah, so it's quite interesting again to see, rather than being a direct son of the Sky Father, or that would have been Thor or Odin, you've seen the myth change a bit. That's it. So yeah, that's the divine twins. I think were there because it was an astounding physical thing to see see 2 people exactly the same.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I would agree. I think that's a good point, because it would probably be very, very, like, people probably thought the idea of somebody giving birth to two human beings that look almost exactly the same, that's probably got to be like shocking for people.
Yeah,
in small societies that don't see that. And another thing I noticed though And I wonder if this happens to do with like people giving birth and maybe one of the child lives, the other one doesn't. And I'm not sure how common this is, but because you often hear about one of the childs having, like, for example, in the Dioscuri, one of them has eternal life, the other one doesn't, and then one who does have eternal life ends up offering his own eternal life to his brother, and they share it and go off and on. One dies.
Exactly. You get this egg because they were born from an egg as well. And you get this pairing thing going on, and you can only see one of them every 6 months. Yeah, I think there's more influence there. Yeah,
but then it gets into this whole, because there's Proto-Slavic twins, Porviet and Pornit, and in this case, one of them dies in the forest where wild animals took care of them, and then the other one is raised by a she-wolf and fed them with their milk. So right away, I'm thinking of Romulus and Remus, because Remus doesn't die right away, but eventually does die, and Romulus becomes the god, and Remus just gets forgotten about. And I'm wondering if there's any connection there. But
that's a really good point, and it's something I always
the she-wolf thing, right?
Tend to talk about. Yeah.
Even beyond that, Cain and Abel. One of them is a tiller of the land. The other one is offering meat.
Yeah, they're both shepherds. One's agricultural and one's pastoral or something. I can't.
Right.
And is it the pastoral one who's the baddie, and the agricultural one's the goodie in terms of biblical myths? I think that's how it. So that's almost like an anti-Indo-European thing going on there. Isn't quite that, but
a polemic.
Yes, in effect that us agricultural farmers are having a great time, and there's all these people who've got all these cows who are coming through, and they're causing us aggro. Don't trust them people. And
because the Cainites, who are second century Christians that came along, and they flipped that myth on its head and said, no, Cain was the good one, Abel was the bad one. And you don't just do that randomly. They must.
No, those reflexes are done as a direct result of pushing back against the culture or against the tradition.
Yeah, and you have to wonder if they have their own culture that they're coming from, or they're saying, no, that the tiller of the land, that's the divine one, that's the righteous one. So you have to wonder if this ancient myth goes back a little bit farther, and people know this, and you know what I mean. Like, it's a lot of questions.
So that goes back. This is why your initial question was really big, because it's very simple for people to, or easy for people to forget that our mythology is quite layered. So, and I heard you had a great chat with Derek about it. I don't know, I spoke to you about this last time we spoke, is because this is the thing that really sort of blew me up when I mentioned this, is that we see, let's say, the Olympian gods in Greece, but then we see other gods laying around like Demeter, who is not an Olympian but has a lot of power, very Earth Mother-like. And she has, obviously, Persephone has a daughter who goes to Hades, and she's representing agriculture. And that is reflected in another myths, all the way from Inanna to Baldr in Scandinavia. And so, without doubt, we are seeing traces underneath the Olympians who are definitely Indo-European flavoured gods. We're seeing the agricultural flavoured gods still remain underneath, but they're poking through the earth of archaeology, mythological archaeology. In effect, you can see glimpses of them. And I think what we're talking about here is actually, if we could remove those Indo-European gods, we'll see this whole pantheon of gods, including the divine twins, probably still floating around in there, as well as other gods, such as the Earth Mother or Mother Nature, or whatever you want to call her, taking a really big role, along with a Sky Father / storm-ish type god.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's hit a couple questions that I see.
Okay.
Let's see what we got. First one is from Seth High, who says, "You guys rock." My question's in the comments above. Thank you, Seth, for that. Let's see what the question is. Was listening to Dr. Tabor's book, where he refers to the two messiahs, wondering where these two, John and Jesus, related to the twins, the two witnesses in Revelations, horsemen. What do you think?
So I'm not a biblical scholar, but I do believe a lot of biblical myths steal from other cultures. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm not particularly religious, because any story you tell me that is religious, I can show you an older story where it's come from.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm pretty sure they're not a direct reflection of the divine twins. They're just probably leveraging the power the divine twins have. Definitely. I can't see that. But I say I don't know much about John and Jesus. I don't know. I'd probably look more to you, to be honest, Neil, than having a qualified opinion on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know how much you can show that. I mean, I guess it's a good question. I don't know how much you can like find out about that. But I think another aspect is the twin Judas and Thomas was called the twin. Thomas Judas was called the twin, or even looking at James, who's also called the brother of Jesus. We almost wonder there's something going on there, but really I don't know, because the authors of these gospels don't really get into that. It's just kind of like a little drive-by hits, like, oh yeah, this guy's nickname is Twin, by the way. Anyways, next passage, like they don't really explain what they mean by that.
And there are two types of twin, which you sort of touched on earlier, and people get confused about them, and they really need to be separated. So the Romulus and Remus twins are not the same as the divine twins, not at all. So you get twins of creation and the divine twins, and the twins of creation tend to be more primordial. So you could argue that Apsu and Tiamat are twins of creation.
There you go.
Two servants, you got Romulus and Remus, but the twin of creation is usually associated with the name of Yemo, or cognate of that, which means twin in Indo-European. So Yema, Gaia-Martan, all the like, they're all Tuesto, Emir, they're all associated with twin. And you see that as a figure that is often used to create the world in Indo-European mythology, and we can look into that in a little bit if you want.
Yeah, while you're on that subject, the myth of the divine twins in that aspect, Yemo and what's the other one?
Manu. Yeah.
How does that go? How much of that do we have reconstructed?
Well, there is a reconstruction. We don't know how accurate it is, but we feel fairly confident that the myth of Manu and Yemo basically goes, there was a cosmos, or a chaotic cosmos, and after that Manu and Yemo came as primordial beings, and then there's guesses on when the gods came. The gods probably came as they were floating through the cosmos, working out what to do, and Manu said to Yemo, we need a home, and Yemo said, okay, sacrifice me, and with my body parts make a home, and that's how he makes the earth. And then
notice how one of them has to die for the other one to
exactly. But in the original myth, and this is where we don't necessarily see this, so we get a real cosmogony, is where some of the body of Yemo is then used to create man, and you create classes of man, and this relates to the divine twins. So we see that Manu from the head of Yemo makes priests. From the body, the torso of Yemo makes warriors. From the legs of Yemo makes farmers or providers. And then from all parts of Yemo's body, he makes the king. And then with this, Yemo dies and Yemo becomes lord of the underworld. So we see Yama and Yema and alike as, and even Ymir in an early Scandinavian mythology was almost certainly lord of the underworld. So he survives. So he's dead physically, but not dead in persona, in terms he lives on in myth, and Manu becomes the priest. But what you find then is you have this king figure who is a king because he consists of all the parts that have used to make up the world, so he understands how the world works. He consists of the parts that priests, warriors and farmers are made up of, so he understands them, and that's why he's the king. And so then we get a couple of other bits of mythology going on. You get one where if the king gets his arm chopped off, for example, he can no longer be king because he no longer understands warriors, but also because he is no longer one with the land, and so the land will suffer, and then you can't farm, and that. And we see that in myths and legends such as King Arthur. You'll see that quite a lot. But what we also see is that the divine twins, when I said one was a warrior and one was a sort of provider, in effect, the fact like the divine twin seems to be associated with those two classes of people being created in creation. So the warrior and the provider, rather than the priest and the king, who are sovereign figures. They tend to relate to the non-sovereign figures.
Wow, that's great. And how old is that myth? By the way, Graham Pong's ahead of me on this question. I just noticed that. Thank you for the super chat, Graham. Manu,
Okay.
Yemo, and Trito, relations with the divine twins. You kind of just touched on that.
Exactly. So they're not related. It is a twin story, but I do not. I believe those twins on. What it may. Well, actually, I lie. There is a possibility that the divine twins existed pre Proto-Indo-European culture, so within the traditions of agricultural farming, and then as part of the pastoral farming growth, those divine twins carried on, but there was also a reflex to make them, because divine twins tend to be really powerful, really well respected, that it could be that they were combined into this being to become Yemo and the twin of creation. So in effect, there are two twin myths, and that isn't impossible. As I say, there's a lot of contradiction in divine twin mythology. In Greek, both twins have been fathered by equally as many different people as each other. So that is a possibility. Isn't something I've ever properly considered or researched, because they seem so different and it'd be so difficult to tell. I mean, it would be great if they were, but then that would mean that when Yemo dies and he becomes Lord of the Underworld, I don't know how that would fit in with that twin motif. So, yeah, I don't know. You caught me sort of off guard. But that's something I really want to think about. Perhaps I'll make a video on that in a few months. I'll have a ponder of that.
Now, you mentioned how this is very old. Do you have any ballpark range? Is it bronze?
For the Manu and Yemo, yeah. So the Manu and Yemo myth is because they had a big cow with them as well, because cows were the most important thing. And so that links to pastoral farming. So you're talking at least 6,000 years ago with links with Proto-Indo-European language. But I'd actually push it back a little earlier than that. I'd say, could it be almost as much as 7, even 8,000 years old, you start seeing the development of that myth appearing. And that's around the Black Sea. And that's where that happens. So it's sort of north of the Caucasus Mountains. It's also north. So where you get the Euphrates and Tigris rivers and all agricultural farming all starting, there's Caucasus Mountains just about it. And just above that is where we see the Indo-European. So they're close enough to have interaction, but there's enough geographical distance to ensure that cultures are quite separate as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can see that definitely. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, I was just looking up the there is a 3rd century Greek writer by the name of where'd it go? Oh, okay, here it is. Athenaeus of Naucratis. He wrote a work that's called the Dēļos Ph₂tēr, and he describes these two twins called Eurytus and Catitus, the white horse youths, and said they were born from a silver egg.
Yes.
So this is basically another.
That's the egg myth, as I say. The egg myth where they split into two, and that's a later myth. So the horses. So when we were farming cows and doing the pastoral farming as Indo-Europeans, we weren't farming horses at the time. So the farming of horses and the association of the divine twins with horses must come at a later date. From that, so there is some evolution in the divine twin myth from sort of the early Indo-European too, then, which you could then argue is, well, does that actually mean that those divine twins were around at the start of the Indo-European traditions and culture? And we can't necessarily guarantee that, but what we can say is that because of the dispersal of Indo-European peoples to India, Persia, and Scandinavia, and Germania, and the rest of Europe, because of that, and they all have those stories, it would make sense that story existed at the start of that dispersal. Otherwise, not all those regions would have that same story. So there's a gap of, well, they had that story, but then that story evolved to include horses. So either there was a second dispersal a lot later, or something else happened. There's a lot to unpick there. Which, as a mythologist, I'm probably not the best place to talk about. You probably need someone who's a geneticist and linguist to understand those dispersals to show how that could be affected like that.
Sure. Daniel Whitaker, thank you for the super chat. The Gravitian burial site, Krems Wartburg, Austria, has twin brothers buried together, 31 was KY.
Years old. 31,000 years old.
Oh, I see. 1,000 years old. I didn't even notice. I'm like, wow, that's really okay. That's why I didn't notice that. 31,000 years old. That's mind blowing. One stillbirth and the other aged to about 15 months. Wow.
Yeah. And that's where culture really started to explode for certainly in Eurasia. So that's just after the Venus figures have been created and the Lion Man and all this. That's the same culture developing.
Really? That's those Venus figurines and those lion men go back 30,000 years.
Or over that, probably 35. Yeah.
Wow. And so I've always wondered, because we know so much about history from about 3,500 BCE up until
when history started, yes. I mean, in Greek, that's about 776 BCE.
Sumerians start writing in cuneiform.
Oh, so yeah.
We can reconstruct the Sumerian world very well. We know we know they had a postal system. We know they had a government. We know they had armies. You know, they had metallurgy. They had mathematics. We know all that stuff because we can read we can read.
And we can date it. The important thing is when you've got a position to date it, you can date it. Yeah.
But when you go before that, when we just have rock carvings and paintings on rocks, and we don't, I mean, how do we reconstruct? I mean, this might be the next frontier. My, looking into studies stuff, whatever you want to call it, is like what about before 5,000 BCE? What is the world like? Do you want to can you give it what your own opinion is, a quick shot at that? Like, you don't have to be right.
There isn't a single answer, unfortunately, because people forget that different parts of the world were working. It's what's going on in Egypt, 5,000 BCE is very different.
Let me ask you this: around the coast of the Black Sea, from 10,000 BCE to 5,000 BCE, what do you think?
Okay, so that's where you start seeing a transition from transition into agricultural farming and then eventually into pastoral farming, and that's partly because of the area and the ecosystem that's there that allows good farming. So what happens is, farming didn't happen straight away. It wasn't like we woke up one day and said, "Well, we're going to farm now." We actually see that the grasses that are harvested in the containers we found with them, we start off farming 20% of our crop. And then 500 years later, we're farming 50% of the crop. And then 500 years later, we're farming 80% of our crop, of our seeds. So farming takes, 1,000, 2,000 years to really get going. And so you'll see, and that probably applies to pretty much everywhere where farming went. It took a while to get there, I'd say. Although the later people would probably have a head start because the technology would have grown a bit, but that's it. So because the Black Sea is reasonably close, say, to the Euphrates and Tigris, where the hub of all this really started, I would say that agriculture farming came along, and soon they realised, because there must have been cows in the area, and as well as horses, that we could use those and get better food from it because we're all in one place and we can work together. I mean, that was a big thing. If you're farming, you can create a large community, and if you create a large community of people, you can do big things. Some people spend their time building large brick triangles in the desert. Other people, they spend their time catching cows and creating the wool.
Wow, that's got to be
all at the same time, sort of thing. So it's weird.
It's trying to picture in my mind what the world was like back then. Like, it's sort of like, I don't know. It's you get into you're thinking it's like a movie, like it's like an ancient mythology movie. Like there's no, I don't know, there's no technology. It's just people.
But everybody say so different. There's still a ton, and because at the same time in Britain, people were still very much in the Stone Age, 5,000 years ago. I mean, and then we're starting to get into metals in. Certainly, we see that in around the Black Sea. By that time, there was some basic forms of metalworking, and I'm sure that must have spread elsewhere. So, there was a huge discrepancy in technological advantage or differences, and there was real cultural differences in terms of how the world worked. I mean, Egypt and the Near East worked very differently to Asia, which was very different to Australia, very different to what was going on in the Americas, into Europe. So it was the world was very different. I mean, people could still have been hunting mammoths 8,000, 10,000 years ago, and where in Egypt, you're making irrigation and farming fields.
Wow, that's a good point. That's a really good point. It's interesting. Yeah, thank you for that super chat. Graham Pong is back with another one. Dog sacrifice ceremony related to divine twins.
Okay. So I'm not so familiar with dog sacrifice. I'm aware it's there, and I believe it was more associated with funerary rites, or they couldn't afford to get rid of a horse. So we find this evolution of sacrifice happens. So initially, cows were sacrificed. Then we find that horses get sacrificed, but not horses for everyone. Horses tend to be sacrificed as part of a sovereign ritual. So if you're a king, they may sacrifice a horse. Or if you're marrying a queen, we start hearing about rituals involving horses and queens, which we can't really talk about here. But some weird things were going on, and I think that the dog is probably an animal they could afford to sacrifice, but still meant a lot to them, because there must have been, we started to get personal attachments to dogs. Right. And what we also find is that we see in ancient rituals that the dog and birds, to some effect, are thought of as being a vessel to go from this realm to the other world. So we see rituals where if you die, rather than be buried, and we see this in Persia and in India, bodies are deliberately left on the ground for the dog to eat. And if the dog ate them, they then could go to the other realm and let your body go there. And that's how you travelled. And I think there must be some connection with that ritual, because that's a very old ritual. But I also think that access to if there wasn't a dog around, birds would eat the body, and then the same thing would happen. But I think part of that aspect leads to the wild hunt and the association of dogs and birds, ravens and wolves, with the wild hunt and death. So that's it. But yeah, in terms of, I mean, there are dogs. I mean, I don't think there was much dog sacrifice in Europe. Certainly in Indo-Iran, that neck of the woods. But I'm not overly familiar with that aspect. That there isn't much mythology around that, apart from as I say, as part of death. And then we go into the stories of dogs being the judges or judgment within Indo-Iranian mythology of the death. So where we had the ferryman, which eventually of the dead, which you see in Greece, and that used to be part of wider mythology across all of Indo-Europe. We actually see in Persia that myth change from being a boat to a bridge, and then we eventually see there's a dog on the bridge protecting you, so you can't go to the underworld unless a dog lets you past, and that leads into Cerberus type mythology. That there's this dog there to get that, so the dog becomes a really powerful sort of item within that mythology around death. So that's probably my knowledge of dogs with mythology in Indo-Europeans.
Wow, that was an interesting question. Good answer. Thank you for that. Benson DeVito, thank you for the super chat. What happened to Vil and Ve?
Vili and Ve.
Vili and Ve. Were they twins? With Poseidon and Zeus were twins originally, as both share similar early myths and overlap?
Wow, right. So this is a whole university course we're about to get into here. So Odin, Vili and Ve. So there are differing academic opinions here. Some believe they are just different versions of Odin. Some believe that they are different gods, and that part of that is because we also see in Nordic mythology the use of, I think it's Hodor and Lothor as alternatives to Vili and Ve in certain myths. So in the creation myth of the Old Norse, when humans are created, there are two flavors of the story. One, Odin, Vili and Ve create humans from trees. Well, that's the assumption of the translation. Other is Odin, Hothor, and Lothor create it. So people again say are Hothor and Lothor different flavors of Odin, which seems unlikely. And if they're not, then I would apply that Vili and Ve are probably not different flavors of Odin. They are very separate people, but there's no indication to say they are twins, but they do have some aspects to them that are different to Odin, because when creating humans, you would expect Odin to give poetry, but he doesn't in the standard translations of the Volaspor, which is where this comes from. Because we've got a couple of versions of the Volaspor, which is the sort of creation myth of and Ragnarok myth of Old Norse. So no, I don't think they're twins. What happened to them? They just weren't important enough to be written about in the poetic Edda or the prose Edda. We will never know, and that's really frustrating. I am trying to do some research on them to find out if we can find any more about them of any significance, but there is just so little out there, and what is out there tends to be written by Christian scholars, and therefore subject to some bias, which may mean what we understand isn't correct.
That's a very big point about a lot of the Norse mythology stuff. It's translated and passed down by Christian scholars, and whatever they wanted there to be out there is what's out there. Whatever we lost, we're lost. But you do a good job of reconstructing this stuff.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on the Old Norse manuscripts and Anglo-Saxon manuscripts. That's where I started this. So yeah, but yeah, you have to be very careful, and there are real humdingers of made up nonsense within the prose Edda. So the works by Snorri Sturluson, he's written myths that I know many people in here who want to be a Viking, let's say, follow, but those are actually literally Christian recreations of conversion myths. Yeah, they were never told by the Scandinavians or by the pagans and the heathens.
Do you think the myth of Odin dying as a sacrifice for the world you think that's a Christianized retelling? Because you have to say, or I could be wrong.
You're asking some big questions, and it wouldn't be a lie to say over 100,000 pages of literature has probably been written on that very question.
Yeah.
So there are some which say, did Odin sacrifice himself, or is someone sacrificing himself as Odin, or is someone else just sacrificing themselves and they get the name of the Yggdrasil wrong? So I've done a piece about the Yggdrasil, which is the tree in Scandinavian, like Nordic mythology, and the Odin is meant to hang himself, we believe, from the Yggdrasil. But when what is the Yggdrasil? And if you translate it, it means Odin's horse. But what I actually say is actually some poetic simplifications going on here. And it doesn't mean Odin's horse, because it used to be called Odin's Yggdrasil. So you wouldn't call something Odin's horse. That makes no sense. So something's happened with the name to change it. And eventually the conclusion of that is actually, I believe the Yggdrasil was in effect a development of the Tree of Life. And the Tree of Life is a very interesting piece of myth we can also go into. So was it an influence from Christianity? I'm not so sure. It is. There was synchronicity going on, without a doubt. You can see that. There's a very good article a while ago about why people wore Thor's hammers, and they were wearing them because Christians were wearing crosses. So you saw, another culture seeing that. So we'll wear Thor's hammer then, and you see these things sort of happening. So it may be that there is synchronicity there, and if your Jesus was crucified, we better do something with our Odin. But the fact is that Odin's doing this to find magic and alike, and to find the answer to Ragnarok makes me feel that the story is older than or has different roots than Christianity.
Wow, that was a good answer. Thank you for that. Here's a good question by Imposter Suspense. Thank you for that super chat. Thoughts on Skyfather? How does he end up in both Vedic and Hellenistic myths? Dyās Ph₂tēr.
That's a linguistic thing, and only the language remains in the myth, not the god. And what I mean by that is that Dyaús, we know, goes to Zeus, goes to Jupiter. We see that quite, and they say in the Indic. but the shape of the Sky Father, this god, isn't the same. So Zeus, we touched on earlier, is a supreme god. He isn't just a Sky Father. He has ultimate power. He's got the storm god attributes, but he's taken all the mother goddess of the sort of agricultural gods before him and absorbed them, which is very different to the Sky Father, who in effect looks over the world from the European perspective, which is very different to, let's say, Thor. Thor was a sky god in the Nordic realm. He was the most popular god. He's more popular than Odin. We just hear a lot about Odin because he is a god of the sovereign people, so the gods of the kings, and because therefore they would probably be more aware of them when writing the poems we now currently just have in our mythology. So just the name Dyaús means God. I mean, we see it in Tyr as well. It's just a name for God, but the god associated with it isn't necessarily the same.
I see what you're saying. And it's you almost want to, it almost sounds like Tyr and Thor could be cognates, but they're actually not.
Definitely not. Very, very, very different. Yeah.
Yeah. I noticed that happens kind of not often, but it happens.
You can sometimes, yeah. And
you run into two gods that look like their names are cognates, but they're actually not.
Exactly.
You run into traps that way.
It's understanding, what an etymology actually is versus whether they sound the same. Sounding the same has no link to whether the words are actually connected.
Yeah. So there. Thank you for that question. No, it's good.
Good question.
Because you do have a Vedic version of this Dyěws Ph₂tněr, and then Zeus Ph₂tněr, Zeus Ph₂tněr, or Zeus Ph₂tněr becomes Jupiter.
Yes.
So you can see that that's a nice linguistic lesson that people can start with, and I definitely need to get more linguistic and philologists on here to talk about some of this stuff because it's some fascinating stuff. And language is the one thing that doesn't lie. Like you can trace languages back, and you can tell this. You could see
along with genetics, and that's exactly actually how we do trace mythology. So people often tell me, John, how do you know these stories are older than the Epic of Gilgamesh or whatever? They're not written down. How do you know? And we use our ability to understand how language has evolved and dispersed, so we can trace back Indo-European to say 6,000 years ago. So we know if people who use the same Indo-European language are telling the same myth, we can have a fair idea that it's come from that source. But we can also use genetics to map dispersals of people and see if myths follow that. And by looking at the content of myth, we can see if the myth change or doesn't change as it goes on these dispersal routes, because myths, unlike sort of a general story, and this is really important because people get this wrong. So myths are, whilst most people think they're lies or fiction, they actually have a truth. They actually have a sacred truth. There is a real belief by a particular set of people in that story. Now, the rest of the world may not believe the story. Let's take the Bible, for example. There's a good chunk of the world that doesn't believe the Bible, chunk of the world that does. But those who do protect and maintain that Bible's integrity and the stories within it. Right. And that is why we can see myths preserved and not necessarily folklore and stories. And if we can see that be preserved across a dispersal of people, let's say Canaanites, into other areas, well, we actually do see it from Mesopotamia and the Ugaritic texts into the Old Testament. We can see the same myth themes, the same words used within the story, like really odd descriptive words within the same similar myths, flow from the Near East through Ugaritic into the Canaanite area. And we can actually say, well, obviously the story came a few hundred years before, 500 years before, from Mesopotamia into the Levant. And that's how it sort of works.
Yeah, I love this. This is just so fun to talk about. That's a good question. Thank you for that. Kensington Cisco with the $10. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Do you think the Hurrian Kekuli Mitanni chariot horse trainer text and earlier references from 1800 BC in Hittite and Old Indo-Aryan that honors the Aśvins, Indra, etc., proves horse mythos comes from India. Wow.
So in short, no, but you probably want $10 worth of answer. So
Yeah.
I say no because we can tell, because it's who it's being spoken about, we can tell there's some Indo-European influence within that. But how do we prove it's from India and not from somewhere else? Well, we need to actually take that mythos and see if examples of that myth appears elsewhere, like I've just said. So if there's similar myths around, and that is a sort of central point when we see when we have no dispersals from the Hittites outwards to those places, then we could say it's a Hittite myth. If we see India dispersal from India back into sort of Persia and then into Anatolia, then yeah, we could say it's from India, but we don't necessarily see that, so we can't say for sure. So how we tend to work, how I tend to work, and some of my colleagues, is we use something called phylogenetics, which basically gives us a statistical probability of something being right. So we would say, oh, there's a 20% chance that came from India, or an 80% chance, or whatever. But I really can't say. I mean, there's as good a chance it came from Persia, and we lost the myth because of Zoroastrianism came along and pretty much wiped out an awful lot of sort of culture. When Zoroastrian came along, like it was anti-war, and it just threw the book out the window. And we do see clues within the text hinting at the older Indo-European mythology, but they're few and far between. So no, we can't say it proves it. There probably is a percentage chance it did, but I don't think that is a majority percentage chance, or something I would say is significant.
So is that what happened with these Eurasian myths? They get sort of stomped out by the Zoroastrian movement?
In Persia, it does. So so we do have, we see glimpses of talking of the Xanada, which is the spirit of kings. We see talks of twins, and Geomart. So Geomartan, you can go to Geomart, which goes to Geo, links to Yemo, which links to Yemo. So you see a quite extensive transition of the Yemo twin, or primordial twin, within Geomartan. A key figure in Zoroastrianism.
In the Zendavesta, the first man is called Manu. Exactly.
So you see little hints of it, but they say in terms of the whole mythos, because they started to demonize the warriors and create this real split, and then this is where hell comes from, and judgment at death, and they introduced so many aspects like that, and they tended to flow into India. So we see India pick up a lot of those ideas. So it is, if there was a myth of horses in Persia, it would possibly have flown to India, and that would make sense, because if the Indo-European descended Indo-European, which is on the steppe, let's call it the Ukrainian steppe for political reasons right now, that would have flown from Ukraine down into Anatolia, Persia, and through India.
And so it's also right in the middle of Greece and India, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
You can see how they can get from one side to the other from that middle area.
Yeah, and they went at different times. So some went, say, across the north of the Caucasus and round. Some went through Anatolia, through Persia, and they arrived at different times. And that's how myths can change as well.
I love the beginning of this question, though, starting off with the Hurrian, Kukuli, Mitanni people. There's a fascinating time period in that part of the world.
Yeah.
A lot of these pre-Socratic philosophers are from that region in Anatolia. Like, we think of Greek philosophers as like all of them in Athens, but a lot of them are Ionian. A lot of the pre-Socratics are Ionian philosophers.
Well, you have to work out where the history is as well.
Right.
So, there could have been some philosophers in England. God bless her, but nothing's written down, so you never know. Yeah, it's just what history tells us.
That's a good point. And even Tacitus even says, when he talks about the Celtics, the Gauls, he says that the Druids are one of the smartest people on the planet. They're just as learned as everyone else in mathematics and science and astronomy, but they don't write anything down.
Exactly, they don't write anything down. Yeah,
they're just all oral. Like, that's got to be such a weird thing. And then so we don't even know what they knew or what they were.
No, there's very little. There's some. I mean, there's there's a great piece within, I think it's in Germania, Texas, Germania, about how the Romans fought the Druids to kill them.
Right.
And I did a piece about translating what it actually meant. So what happened is the Roman army decided to wipe out the Druids in Britain, and they sort of pushed them towards the Isle of Anglesey, which is in northwest Wales, right on the edge of Britain mainland, out on the west. And they talk about the Druids were on the beach and they were chanting and screaming as the Romans.
I heard this. I know that I read this before. It's so good. Go ahead. Sorry.
And the Romans are there wondering what's going on, and then all these women come along, running around screaming with flames, and the Romans rush up and kill them all, and all the Druids burn to death, and like the Romans think, yeah, we've won, and then all of a sudden they realise
it was a sacrifice.
Have we just sacrificed the Druids in their own ritual? Have we been cursed? Yeah.
Complete accident. The Roman legion walks into the middle of a human sacrifice about to go down. And it was a mass sacrifice. It wasn't just one person.
Yeah, it was all the Druids, pretty much all the Druids.
Hundreds of people that were going to get sacrificed. And the Romans didn't even know. They just walk right in the middle of it. And there's a big ceremony. They're all chanting and doing all the types of weird, like,
whatever Druids do. Yeah.
Whatever the Druids are doing, right. And the Romans are just like freaked out by this. Like
they are, but they were more freaked out by the fact that they took part in it. So they actually felt like they were part of that sacrifice, which then, if you've seen at that point in time, that's when Boudicca within England then rose up. And it took the Romans a little time to get their act together to stop that uprising. So it was a very interesting part of history, that. But yeah.
No, and that's a good point, because the Romans, when by the time you get to Hadrian's Wall, they're blocking off that part of the world. Is like that's like hell. We don't even want to conquer that place, because whatever's over there, they got some evil demonic spirits over there. We don't even want to go over there.
They didn't do a good job. I mean, if you go to the Antonine Wall, which is north of Hadrian's Wall, quite a lot north in Edinburgh, they made that out of peat. So the last thing you really want to do is make a big wall out of dirt in Scotland, because it will get washed away in the rain.
Right.
Yeah, quite quickly, which is pretty much what happened. You just left with a big ditch in the middle of Scotland now.
Well, I mean, the only thing I guess it really did do is like prevent armies from coming over with horses and buggies, and like you have to to get over a wall. It takes a lot.
It was passed, but it was trade. It eventually ended up being pretty much a trade position. Yeah. Right. So it's got the Scotties and the Picts couldn't get anything unless they paid taxes or whatever.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating story. I'm glad you told that story. I forgot about that story, actually, but I remember reading that. I think that was Tacitus. I think you're right about that. Yeah. Anyways, thank you for that super chat, Mr. Monster. Thank you for the $5. Appreciate that. Good. Also, good to see you, Mr. Monster. Good friend of mine. I have questions about the ancient axe cult. Did they worship a form of Thor or a form of Odin? Did they originally use clubs before axes?
Right. So before Thor's hammer, it was Thor's millstone, not an axe. So I think an axe is because you see clubs as well in sort of early iconography that Thor holds rather than hammers. So axes are probably slightly different. I don't. They probably, if they had to worship anyone, they'd probably worship Thor, because Thor was a proper war god. Odin created wars and he got people killed, but he didn't take part in war. So you wouldn't trust Odin to be your side man in a battle, but you would trust Thor. So possibility wise, I say Thor is your man on that. But I don't think the axes were a way to recognize Thor. His hammer. They were just a better weapon than a hammer or a sword. No one really fought with swords. In fact, most Romans, even though they rode horses, didn't fight on horses. When they got somewhere, they got off the horse and then ran off with their axe. So they had a particular way of fighting. But they'd rather use spears, to be honest. In war, you want to get as far away from your enemy as possible. Spears and bows were really the weapon of choice for most Europeans.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm pretty sure there was some sort of battle axe culture happening in Europe too, right?
Yeah, they're like the mace. They like the big double-handed axe and the sword. But so much of it was just to look good and ceremonial, as to be used on the battlefield. You can throw an axe, but you wouldn't be running around chopping people up with an axe, because you'll be too close to them. You get cut up.
And when you look at the real effective military schemes, and I'm no expert. I'm not even close to even being able to speak on this. So I'm just going to, somebody who's an expert is going to be like, shut up. But I'm just going to say it anyway. The real successful armies in history were the Macedonian phalanxes, the long spears, the systematic, you know what I mean? And not just like warriors running in. You might have.
Well, it's mainly spears though. So we see this. So Tacitus writes about this. Was it Caesar? I think Caesar writes about it when he first sails to Britain and he fights the Britons, and they had an interesting tactic, which is that they Britons rode into battle on chariots with spearmen at the back. They dropped off the spearmen in the front of battle. They stabbed a few people, then jumped on the chariot and rode back again. And they kept doing that. So, you know, they protected the spearmen from standing in the middle of nowhere. You know, and they just got fresh spearmen in all the time. And that really confounded the Romans for quite some time, because the Romans didn't conquer Britain when they first arrived in 50 BCE. It took them another 50 plus years to do that. Yeah. Because, the way of fighting was quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. Those long spears have those advantage over, you know, especially when you're, you know, I don't know. You know,
you can a lot more force on them and that. Yeah. So yeah, right. Fight with a spear to a sword any day. That's what most people did.
Yeah, there's a good channel that talks about that kind of stuff called Kings and Generals. I love.
Oh yes, I'm familiar with them. Yeah, there's h₁éḳwos is a Icelandic site which actually does research into Viking battle technology, and they actually give people axes and swords to fight each other to see how best to fight and wrestle, and that. It's really good.
I'll tell you what, it's really fascinating how war technology and war knowledge was way more valuable than any resource. Like, like when they talk about how the Romans in this 3rd century, 2nd century BCE, when they conquered Macedonia and Sparta, and how their army was transformed by taking in what they had, and then Rome becomes the center of the West. Like, that's a big deal. Like, Macedonia has it, and then all of a sudden they split up their empire, and then now you have like different parts of the world who all have the same knowledge and experience in warfare. And then there's Romans come up from battling Carthage, and now they're a a hardy people basically, because they're coming out of so many wars, and they clash with the Greeks and win, which was like, that's a big deal. I mean, about the Pyrrhic victory, right? Where Pyrrhus of Epirus, who was he's a Greek king, and he's like third generation down from Alexander the Great.
Okay.
In the western part of Greece called Epirus. He is an independent kingdom that split off from the Hellenistic Empire after Alexander died. Now, this was the place where his mother was from, Olympias. So this kingdom was very rich. They had a lot of the war elephants and stuff getting sent to them through Macedonia when they conquered India and Persia. Anyways, so this is a really rich kingdom, and now they want to conquer the world. They go to Italy thinking that they're going to have an easy time with these Italic tribes. No, they call it a Pyrrhic victory, because Pyrrhus had so much wealth and so many war elephants, so many men to just dispose, that he ends up beating the Romans. But like they lose like 100,000, where the Romans lose like 20,000. So like, really, it wasn't really a victory. They just called it a victory because Pyrrhus was able to leave there.
No one wins war, do they?
Like, I won this war, but no, Rome really did win that. Huge turning point.
You see the technology. I mean, that's like the Indo-Europeans expanding. Why were the Indo-Europeans so successful expanding when they did? That was the horse. As soon as you got on a horse and you could ride and had wheels, that's it. You're a distinct advantage. So all it takes is a small. A wheel's quite, I guess, a big technological advantage, but once you have that advantage, though, if you do your best to push that, absolutely, the world is your oyster at that point.
This person has a good point. We forgot to answer the Poseidon.
Poseidon Zeus question.
You said something, but I guess I was wrong. Sorry.
No, so to me, Poseidon is, I think, well, they're both old gods. I don't, because Zeus is more sky orientated and Poseidon's sea orientated. Are they twins? I don't
They're both brothers. They're both brothers because they're sons of Saturn.
Yeah. I mean,
I don't know if they're twins or not. I think Hesiod says they're born at different times.
Okay, yeah. I don't know whether they could be twins though. You could find that. I don't know. It's no, there's nothing in the mythology that says they are twins, and I'm just trying to see if I can think of any stories that would even suggest they are. I mean, they didn't get on.
You would have to go to Hesiod's theogony first of all. That's where that's where you're going to get the straight answer on who are they. That we know they're brothers. Are they twins? I don't think so.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just trying to see if there's anything in, because you see the stuff from, like, look at the Iliad or this, when Odysseus gets hassled by Poseidon, and Odysseus though is.
You know what? You know what, Benson, David, since you had to drop 2 super chats to get this question, I'm going to look it up right now while we're live. We're going to go right to Hesiod. And we're going to see for ourselves. We're going to look at this together.
Well, okay. I was sort of thinking of the Odyssey and like how, because it wasn't Odysseus. This is Zeus's son, so yeah. But Poseidon was hassling him though, because he had a little ruck with Polyphemus. So
we're going to find where is.
So they didn't get on. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's the same for twins. However, what we haven't really talked about is that not all twins got on with each other. I mean, all were considered good. There are many twin myths certainly outside of Europe and Asia, that where the twins are bad, and cause problems and can kill people. So it wasn't always necessarily considered that they got on.
So here it's right in the beginning of the text. From the Helicon, it says, "Let us begin to sing, who hold great and holy mount of Helicon." All right, so now we go down. Thence they arise and go broad night, field and thick mist, and utter their song with a lovely voice, praising Zeus, the Aegis holder, and queenly Hera of Argos, who walks on golden sandals, and the daughter of Zeus, the Aegis holder, bright-eyed Athena, and Phobos Apollo, and Artemis, who delights in arrows, and Poseidon, the earth holder, who shakes the earth, and revere Themis. It doesn't say if they're born. I don't think that says.
No, Apollo and Artemis. Actually, I thought I'd read something that they may have been twins, or there's something connected there. But yeah, not Poseidon and Zeus, and that's because I think their background is different. They come from different sources, but they both are old, without doubt.
Yeah.
Oh God, so I would say they're pre-Indo-European origins of those gods, definitely.
Yeah, let's see. I don't think it says they're twins, but they're both sons of Saturn. So I don't know. I think.
But if you're primordial being, I mean, how do you give birth? Do you give birth in the same way we do? Is it all, or do you just bear them out? Who knows? You know, I hadn't seen a birth certificate on that one. I don't think Saturn.
I think Hesiod would have said that, the 2 twins.
Yeah. Yeah, if there was something worth knowing about that relationship, but I think that because they didn't get on, it makes me feel like there's nothing. They're just brothers, as opposed to twins.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. Thank you for that. Good question. And by the way, if they were twins, then you'd have to ask, what about Hades? He's a brother too.
Exactly.
So is he? Are they triplets? And I mean, at that point, it gets a little iffy.
Yes, or perhaps that they all were born at the same time, but it has a different relevance than a human having that birth. Yeah.
Good point. Thank you for that. Gaius Julius Windex, thank you for the super chat. Thoughts on the British Apollo, who is said to show up at Stonehenge during solstices and equinoxes and perform songs on the Kithra, old cold father.
British Apollo. So, are we talking in this day and age? This druid chap, is that who we're talking about? Because druids never went to Stonehenge. So if it's part of that link up, then the guy, and certainly on summer solstice, which is really when Stonehenge was really at its peak, it was winter. It's a winter solstice monument because the nights. So the winter solstice is the most important day of the year for heathens and pagans, because we count our days as when the sun goes down. To when the sun goes down rather than when the sun comes up, and the longest night of the year is the most important night because that's when you're closest to the other worlds and the other realms. So, but the British Apollo, I think if it's that person, then I have zero respect for him, because as I say, that sort of person didn't go to Stonehenge. He's creating his own religion, and that's fine. He's creating his own beliefs, but that isn't something I can associate with any ancestral behavioural rituals or beliefs. If that is the same person.
Yeah, it sounds interesting though. British Apollo, like
Yeah.
because I'm not mistaken, Stonehenge is sort of set up for the solstices, right? Or no?
Yeah, it's set up for solstice. So it's set up for the winter solstice, although that happens to also work for the summer solstice. But the belief of academics is that it was more appropriate to be the things were happening there for the winter solstice, because the view is that once the longest night of the year's gone by, then the days are going to get warmer and shorter. The world isn't dying. Because if you're living in the world and you don't understand how it works, and the night's getting longer and longer and longer, you're thinking, well, will the nights ever stop getting longer? Because then you're heading towards death and the dark realms. As soon as they stop getting darker, you think, yay, happy days. We can eat all our wheat and cows.
It makes sense why the winter solstice would be so important, because you're literally your survival depends on the sun coming back.
Exactly. Yeah.
The sun, where is it going? Why is it leaving us? We need crops. We're cold. We're dying. What's going on? All of a sudden, the sun starts getting back again.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Mark that day. That's a whole.
Obviously we made a sacrifice. The gods liked it, and now they're making the days longer again.
Right. That's interesting. You have to wonder about that, because after so long for this happening every year, same time every year, the priests know this is inevitable. It's going to come back. You don't think the priests are actually wondering if the sacrifice is going to work or not? You probably have like peasants who are like, "Oh, the priest, thank you for doing that sacrifice. You really helped."
Exactly. Well, that's why people want to be priests. It's
you got to realize this.
It's easy money, mate. And then some of them set up a Roman Catholic church, get loads of people donate money to them, think they're above the law and do really bad things. It continues.
Yeah, and that's just part of
religion for you, man. That's it.
Class, the royal class, they have both sides,
Yeah.
So that's a really good question. Let's see. I think there might be one more. Oh, here's a good question. I wonder if the Thomas twin in India myth relates to this anyway.
Thomas twin. Not familiar.
That's the Thomas is the one who is one of the apostles who.
Oh, okay.
We touched on it really briefly. I think there might be something going on there. I think she's got a point, but it's just hard to. It's hard to the author. Like I said earlier, the author of the Gospels doesn't really get into what this means. What he means by calling Thomas the twin.
Yeah, the twin of what? And he's certainly not of the same representation as the twin of creation, and I can't imagine they have the same divine power as the divine twin. So it makes no sense. It's just a twin of someone.
Yeah, but it's definitely something to think about. It's definitely an interesting question. Like, why does the Gospels want you to know that he's the twin? No one really knows. I mean, maybe someone knows, but I don't know. But it's a good question.
Not the Gospels. It's not part of this channel,
right?
Find the esoteric information underneath this.
Benson DeVito, thank you for the super chat. The reason I ask about them being twins is because in Homer, Poseidon has power over storm, and originally Poseidon was a horse and storm god. Yeah, Poseidon is called the Earth Shaker. He's the one who's causing the earthquakes in Greek mythology, and Zeus is the Sky Father. He's causing.
Yes, but Zeus wasn't a Sky Father before the Indo-Europeans. He was something else, and although we're not entirely sure. We have some ideas, and because Zeus also was, he was called Zeus Perkinus before Zeus. So, and Perkinus is the Indo-European storm god. So he was absorbing that. So there is some, as I say, it looks like they've come from different backgrounds, but are both very old.
It's like the Ugaritic ball.
Yes. You can see that change is going on. So, yeah, they may have had similar aspects and similar properties, but I think and they are both very old, but I think they are from different traditions and have been absorbed under the Greek pantheon as sort of the Indo-European influence has come in and sort of rearranged things.
And the
Oh no, I'm doing some work on this. I'm not concentrating on the Greek stuff at the moment, but I will, because like I say, I would really love to. I keep calling it the archaeology of myth. I would love to remove that the Indo-European layer and see if we can find the gods, the agricultural gods underneath of that pantheon, because that would allow us to make some other sort of educated assumptions about other pantheons that flowed from the Near East into Europe. So there'll be more of an answer to that. Come back next year. If I'm invited back in a year's time, I might have an answer for that.
Yeah, that's the last super chat. Let's see. JS says Gnostic informant Thor might have Stormhammer and Mjolnir, but the Mesopotamian war god Ninurta had a talking and flying mace named Sharur. Nice.
Indeed. Yes. There'll be the top trumps of gods. So we need a little game to see which god was the strongest.
Nice. Mr. Monster, thank you for the super chat. What do you know about the Anglo-Saxons pagans and their tree that was burnt down by this is a big deal. Charlemagne. This is 800, right?
I think it was about 700, 8th century, I'm pretty sure. And it was the Ehrman, I think the tree we're referring to in Germany now. So Saxons had a very similar mythology to the Nordic people. So where we talked about Nordic people having Yggdrasil as a tree, the Saxons had a tree called the Ehrman, and there was one particular tree that one particular tribe was worshipping around, and yes, as part of the clamping down in their very civilized way that those Christians behaved like in Europe back in those times, they came along and just destroyed it. That's all we really know. I think there is some indication that some people think they know where it was. He probably built a church on it because that's what tended to happen. Churches tend to be built on top of pagan sites. And we actually got a church down the road that has a pagan altar within the Christian church. But I built it on and just left that going. We've got some old churches here.
You have a famous Mithraic temple underground in, I think it's Germany or France. No, it's France, I'm pretty sure. And on top of that, one of the biggest churches in Europe.
Yep, absolutely. So so that's probably that's all I know about it. But the heathens and pagans, certainly non-Christians, were really, really suppressed. But in Charlemagne's time, absolutely horrendous acts were carried out.
Yeah. Charles the Great. That's what Charlemagne means in Latin. Charles.
Well, he's great at
Charles Magnus, Charles the Great.
Mm.
So yeah. I mean, I don't know. It depends on how you look at him. He might be one of the most evil dictators, I guess.
Where you are,
or he's a great holy emperor that was anointed.
Exactly.
Like however you look at it, but obviously it's two ways. There's two sides to every story. Like that might be devastating though. If you're this tribe out in the north, and you have this tree that your ancestors tell you it's thousands of years old, whatever they tell you, who knows? Maybe they say it's 1,000,000 years old. Maybe they tell you it's been years since the world created. They probably
exactly
something like that, right? And then here comes this emperor who's in the name of the Holy Church of Rome. I'm burning this down. Like that's got to be devastating.
That's and you've lost your soul in effect of a religion. You've lost that centerpiece. It is absolutely terrible.
I mean, Christians always talk about how they were persecuted and thrown into the pit in front of lions, eaten by lions, and how do you?
They obviously didn't learn from that lesson, did they?
Didn't learn from that lesson. You just did the same. You guys were even worse after that. You know what I mean? But
exactly, yes. But that's a different topic. It is. But it does still irk a lot of heathens that how, especially even today, in the news of the Roman Catholic Church, how the church gets away with so much.
Yeah,
it's quite
remarkable. But this has been an interesting talk. Anything else you wanted to promote while you're here? I gotta show your channel again.
Nothing to particularly promote. My next video is going to be a mythology 101. So if anyone really wants to understand what a myth is, because it can be quite ambiguous, I'll be talking about that. And then I'll be getting back to my normal diving into myths next year. I just want to thank, if anyone here who watches my channel, just want to thank you for your support. I mean, it's been a brilliant year. I just got an email from YouTube saying I've had over like 5 million views and 100,000 subscribers this year, which is
wow.
I could never have imagined that when I started this. It's an absolute pleasure to teach.
This is my first full year of having this channel from January to like I started this channel less than 18 months ago, honestly. But I think I ended up in this year alone probably with around 30K. I think I had like maybe I had like 4 or 5K at the end of last year. But anyways, roughly 25 to 30,000 this year with like over maybe 2 million views, which I think that's a good first year. I think that's
brilliant. That's brilliant. I mean, compared to being in a university classroom teaching to 10 people, which 9 wish they weren't there.
That's what I owe it all. I owe it all to my guests, honestly. I owe my guests and the people watching. Because
it's the people watching, the questions, they just ask things I would never imagine, and I just love that. And they put me on the straight and narrow and keep me good. And I literally read all my comments, every comment I get. I get thousands and thousands of them. It's an absolute pleasure teaching these people.
Definitely, I'm always looking forward to the next Trekking Forward video. So, guys, go and subscribe. And,
thank you.
And you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.